You got sound?
Let me turn this one on.
1, 2.
That's right.
1, 2. There we go. Okay. So I guess he'll get my slides up. Maybe I should do a different way of introducing myself. We actually, Dakota Lakes Research Farm is a farm that's owned by farmers, a not-for-profit corporation of farmers, and they work with the university. I manage that. I'm actually a university employee, but there's some question whether I have more loyalty to the university than the farmers. Actually, it's more to the farmers. So it's really a unique thing, it's run exactly like that, and it's fun. You got my slides, Tony? Yeah, okay. We had one of our farmers that went in to get, it was the end of the year, just right before the end of the year, and his wife was afraid that he was going to go in and buy a new tractor because, she didn't really think we needed a new tractor, but he didn't like paying the government money, so he wanted to get some depreciation there and stuff, and he went into town he went to the dealership, and the dealer said, "Gosh, look at this tractor, it's got a voice-activated radio," and you get in there and you go radio on, the radio would come on, and go country music, and you go to country music, and you go, kind of like a Siri thing. And he just thought that was great, and he did the heck with it, and he bought the tractor, and he comes home, and his wife said, "You didn't buy a tractor, did you?" "Well, honey, you got to see this radio." And they pull the tractor in the yard, and he gets in there with her, and they're driving around, and he goes radio on, and radio comes on, and country music, and country music. She's still not impressed, and he's not watching where he goes, and he runs into the shed, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Dwayne Beck, Dakota Lakes Research Farm, Pierre, South Dakota." So Dakota Lakes, we use stripper heads. I noticed in the video somebody said we cut it high. We cut everything really high, and I do not in this presentation, but snow catch is really an important thing for us. We're in an area that's not too dissimilar from here. If you went up and looked at your landscape, it's brown and rolly and whatever. The guys for years were doing after the Earl Butts era. They were mostly grazers, and then we had a bunch of land got broke and put into wheat and summerfell. And that's what they were doing, and the land was blowing away and whatever. This is Dakota Lakes right there. We have some irrigated ground, we have dry land. We actually have some grazing land off to the side here. This is real rough grazing land, and then we irrigate this part. This is dry land, and then 5 miles north we got some more dry land that's on a true vertisol. And Tony and I were talking about this last night. He said, "You guys, you have clay soils." We have true vertisols, which are 80% clay and greater, and so they get the big cracks in them and whatever. That's what we have up to the north, because it's more like the western part of South Dakota, and we wanted to look at that. This is what our landscape looks like. There's only trees and major drainage ways. That's some corn, dryland corn that's growing there. Okay. It froze, Tony.
Right now.
Okay. Well. There we go. There you go. But I wanted today I could tell you how we do things, and we've been doing it for over 30 years. We've been exclusively no-till, intense rotation over 30 years. I want to show you what the impact of that was, not talk so much about detail. And Tony has an agri-ecosystem management thing you'll put on the website, and you can download it, or if you email me, I'll send it to you. But I like to talk about the history of why we end up doing what we were doing. It started probably long before us, and it really started when man first started farming. And the stuff you do really started way back whenever, and we've just been doing the same things for centuries, and it hasn't worked well. Okay. Early farming systems were often polycultures. The Native Americans around Pierre, South Dakota, when they were there in the 12, 13, 1400s, They were growing, they were farmers and they were growing polycultures. But negative feedback loops, things would start to degrade, and that would tell them that they maybe needed to quit or they would just move, right? That's what they would do. When civilizations became less mobile, when they started building villages and stuff, there was an increased demand for land. And what happened, especially in Europe and Asia, energy was a limiting factor because it all came from the sun. You had food, feed, and fuel all came from the sun. So I call that contemporary solar. You're using it as it comes pretty much within 100 years. All of the energy was and came directly or indirectly from the sunlight. The products produced by sunlight were used as food and feed and fuel. If we use too much land for the feed for the draft animals or whatever, then you didn't have enough food or fuel. And so the only way to get progress and build cities and whatever, it was really limited because of transport and because of energy. There's not enough food and feed to build cities and fight wars, so empires like the Romans began to expand and increase their territory. And also slavery was involved when you did that. Several centuries of empire building by Europeans and Asian countries occurred between Roman times and the Industrial Revolution. So that's basically what farming was about for thousands or so. In all cases, the goal was to increase quantities of food, fuel, and feed and to support progress, or what people were calling progress. So several years ago, my wife and I went to France and England, did a series of meetings in France. We drive from city to city with an English-speaking GPS in France. We learned a lot of French words from the French people, I think, as we were driving around, but we don't know what those meant. But I don't think it was good. They were accompanied by gestures. But anyway, every time we went to a city, we met up with some farmers, and then they took us to see their castle. Every city had a castle, and they, big granaries and a lot of work and stuff went into that. And then you'd look around, you'd say, well, where'd you get the grain to fill the granaries in the castle? And they said, well, they grew it around the castle. Well, that's what it looked like. So they decided at the point that castle couldn't exist anymore. That didn't really occur to them until you kind of pointed it out. That's good land in France. Okay? And they just keep tilling deeper and deeper. And then they came to the United States. Actually, the LaViandre brothers came to Winnipeg looking for furs. They went across the Continental Divide in North Dakota, which is about as high as that table. The split between the Red River system and the Missouri River system. The thing that Canada from the U.S. is the water system, and the Red River goes in from North Dakota into Canada. So it's one of the only rivers that does that, goes from the U.S. to Canada. And the LaViandre brothers came up the Red River and then went west and over into the Missouri River system and claimed that area for France. In 1741, 1743, there was a lead plate buried above Fort Pierre, South Dakota, where I live, claiming the area for France. And the Europeans all started coming to the U.S. because we need more land. We've degraded our soils, so now I'll go find some more. And they went to Australia and they went to the U.S. or to the Western Hemisphere. And in 1796, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were exchanging letters saying we need to stop degrading our soils in the eastern seaboard or we'll need to go west again. See, like, what aren't they getting about the problems they're having? And here's a LaViandre plate tablet, 1743. And back up. So after the LaViandres came, they started going in and getting the beavers. I don't know if you saw the movie The Revenant. I hope not. But it's a true story in a way. The guy's name was Hugh Glass, and there's a book called Lord Grizzly you could read. That was in South Dakota, where it's just all prairie. So it wasn't very accurate. Dances with Wolves was accurate. That was in South Dakota as well. But they came to mind the Europeans came to mine the soils. My grandfather did that. My great-grandfather, my grandfathers, all of my grandfathers came here to do that. So it's 1803, what did we do? We west. We bought the Louisiana Purchase. And then we sent Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark actually walked across my property. If you read their journals, they'll talk about the big meander right there in South Dakota, and then they come around what we call the pocket, where we actually grow mint. Guys grow mint in that area there because of the ecosystem. And then we're right here along the Missouri River. So I could read those journals, and I knew exactly when Lewis and Clark came across my property by knowing the landscape. So I know what was there before the white man came. Now, they'd already taken out a lot of the beaver, and after Lewis and Clark in 1804 and 1806 coming back, we really didn't have settlement in a lot of that area until after the Civil War. And South Dakota became a state in the 1880s. We had the Dust Bowl, and we had flooding on the Missouri River. 50 years. And it happened at the same time. So how could you have a drought and have flooding? Because you've broken the water cycles. You've broken the mineral cycles. So what's the solution? If you're flooding Omaha and St. Louis and Sioux City and whatever with the Missouri River, well, you put in big dams. You don't go out and try to say, hey, we've got the ecosystem screwed up, let's stop the runoff and again. No, we just put in big dams. And so there's 4 dams in South Dakota. There's 2 more dams upriver in Montana, one in Montana, one in North Dakota. So here's the big meander. You can see we got pivots all along that thing there. Here's the pocket. This is where the mint is right there, and I'm right here. Okay? There's the dam, the pump station, that building right alongside there. This is supposed to be a pump station to take water 200 miles to the east or 120 miles to the east to gravity irrigate. So some of you guys probably gravity irrigate here. We've had experience with that as well, but they never built that because we came along and started saying, well, there's no need to do that. If you don't do tillage, you don't need the irrigation water. Why would you build the big canals and do all that goofing around? And what's happened is those dams are silting in. And we still haven't fixed the water cycle. So now in 2011, we had the case where the dam's almost overtopped and they had to open them up. So these are 7 6-foot diameter pipes running at over 200 pounds of pressure, pumping water through that dam so it doesn't overtop. People downriver did not have a good day. Now, they were going to take the water 2 hours to the east because we didn't have flat land. In the 1930s, when they were building the dams, you had to do gravity irrigation. We're on rolling ground. You didn't have a pivot. So in the interim, when I entered the scene in the 90s, after Earl Butts, everybody was putting in pivots. 100 psi at the pivot, so you can spread the water out, put the water on it about an inch every 40 minutes. They still had runoff. There comes water out of the irrigator back to the river. We got 2 dry here, about right here, 2 wet here, and water's running out. They couldn't make the water go in the ground. The water cycle wasn't fixed. It doesn't do any good to put the water on if you don't have the water going in the soil. So here's where we're located. Again, Pierre's there. We're right out east of Pierre. Again, take a picture of what we look like. I don't know why I got those in there twice. There's our native vegetation. Okay, you recognize that? So a lot of residue. If we manage the water better, we can grow dryland corn fine. We probably average 110 or 15 bushel the acre. This year we averaged 200. on dryland corn, which we haven't told anybody in South Dakota because it's embarrassing. Because a lot of people had a bad year because it was too wet. Wonderful problem to have. So the research farm is owned and directed by farmers. All the fixed facilities and land and much of the irrigation equipment is owned by the corporation. 11-member board of directors. And I work with the board of directors and SDSU. We didn't say anything about no-till here. We said we're going to do a better job of managing the ecosystem. The only way we felt that we could make water go in the ground, we did the research, was to no-till. And once we decided we needed to no-till to make the water go in the ground, then the question began, how do you manage your crops and whatever so you don't have to spend too much on herbicides and insecticides and things and get lots of diseases. We haven't had to use a spray of insecticide in 18 years. Think about that. We still use herbicides, but not all that many, because we let crop rotation and competition and natural cycles take care of things for us. So here's where that proposed irrigation project was. Pierre's here, right here. We're down along the river right there. I talk right now about this area here as being the one we influence in terms of crop production, because this area is probably over 90% all no-till in there. So if we compare corn, soybean, spring wheat, winter wheat, sunflower production in these 3 crop development districts I had outlined there, we increased production by $1.6 billion in 2014 as compared to 1986. And if you drive through that area, there's new grain bins, there's new houses, there's new shops. We have, the most important thing to me is the small schools, the small town schools. I taught at a school when I was first out of college before I did my PhD. They had 2 kindergarten through 8th grade classes. It went down to 1. They almost closed the school and consolidated. They're now back up to 2 classes all the way through the 5th grade, because they're now building population again. We have an ethanol plant. Okay, we have a soybean crushing plant in the area. So it's been a real success. But we didn't achieve that because we set out to improve yields. And what most universities do is they go, I'm going to make your wheat better. We're going to come out and do all these trials and make your wheat better. And what I said is, we're going to try to, wheat alone can't do it. We're going to try to see if we can do this whole system that will, and almost all this is dry land now, by the way. Almost all the irrigators went away. Can we manage this system better? The light bulb was not invented by incrementally making candles better. And I stole that from somebody. But it's a way of thinking about things. So let's look at the water cycle, energy flow, mineral cycle, and community dynamics. There's a rain feed plants, recharge groundwater or runoff, deep percolate, and cause problems. Just think of all the flooding that's happening in the United States now. Everywhere. Our water cycles are broken. Guys in the Corn Belt are putting in drain tiles, and then we flood even worse. The minerals go out with the runoff and the drain tile stuff. Again, we were doing that. Now I can put 2 inches of water on in 9 minutes. 7 to 9 minutes. And we will walk people behind those irrigators. And they don't get their feet muddy. And they don't sink in. I almost have to push people into the field because they think they're going to step in that field and get their feet muddy. But if you go out in native prairie or go on your lawn that's just been watered, you don't get your feet muddy. That's the kind of thing that we have developed under irrigation. Okay? No-till is not about lack of tillage, but about managing the soil, water, soil structure, and soil biology and carbon compounds in the soil. So it's the only way you can do that. If you do tillage, you screw everything up. You kill all the biology. and whatever. So there's our soil. That's that armor people will talk about. These are macropores. They're worms or something that's made a hole there. The water goes in the holes, and the air comes out of the holes. That's how you put water in the ground. You got to let the air come out and the water go in. If you cut that hole, it's just like putting your finger over the top of a soda straw. Water doesn't move. Okay? If you've done tillage in the fall, early in the spring when it's wet, how deep do you fall into the ground? As deep as you've tilled. Should tell you something. And they shouldn't be telling you to till deeper. But some people say, oh yeah, it means I got to till deeper. I go, no, don't till at all. So there's a pin stuck in one of my macropores in the cornfield. I lose a lot of pins showing people all the macropores. They're about every 8 inches or more in there. So for you, how many pivot irrigator guys we got? That's a 20-year wheel track. We haven't filled that wheel track for 20 years. Look at that. Crazy. And I said last night in the car as we were driving that my go-to, if somebody comes that's an irrigator, I go show them a wheel track. And then I got them. And then they go, how in the heck do you do that? And then we can start a conversation. So here we've planted not broadleaves and grass, wheat, and we planted the wheat green into that. Don't do that everywhere, and I don't do it if there's any grass there. This year we had some grass there, so you spray a selective, take the grass out, and then plant the wheat so you don't get the bridging of diseases. Take the E out of ET. Evaporation's got to be a big issue here. It's a big issue for us. Keep that cover on the soil. You take the E out of the ET. Make all the water go through the plants. Make the water enter the soil. And then as you increase organic matter, you increase the water holding capacity of the soil appreciably. So since you've started and reduced organic matter, now your soil doesn't hold as much water. Now we started Dakota Lakes because of irrigators. It's the irrigators that started it. We had 11 members that were irrigators on the board of directors and 11 conventional tillers when we first started the farm. We got the money together to start this farmer-owned farm, and we're going to put the irrigators and stuff on, and I showed them some budgets, and I said, if we commit to being strictly no-till, it costs this much. And if we're going to do tillage, and you want to keep trying to do tillage comparisons, which are stupid, but if you wanted to do that, it costs this much more. And they had quite a discussion. Finally, the president of the board says, I know how to farm with tillage. I don't know how to no-till. Let's just no-till the whole thing. We have not done tillage since we went there. I personally haven't done any tillage-based stuff since the mid-1980s. And we started Dakota Lakes in 1990. Ecosystems harvest sunlight. So that's what you're doing, is you're harvesting sunlight and water and carbon dioxide. And if you remove those products from the ecosystem, you starve your microorganisms. So I know there's a lot of people alfalfa and ship it somewhere. You ship nutrients and you ship your energy and you ship water. Now, if you got lots of water, maybe you don't care if you ship that, but the energy, you've got to leave something there for the microbes, and that might be where the cover crops do come in. It increases that. Is the energy constant or finite? Well, the sunlight comes up every morning. If the sunlight quits coming up, we just have a big party, like Mardi Gras for 3 days, and then we're pretty well done. I mean, we're not going to last very long. But if you control the sunlight, that's yours and it's free. Fossil fuels are finite, and I'm not sure why we're so in love with using fossil fuels. They're expensive, right? Is the energy source you use benign or potentially damaging? Well, sunlight, other than heard on the radio this morning, you have lots of skin cancer here, right? Because of your climate and your of Caucasian ancestry where you're not used to intense sunlight. But other than that, if we keep covered up, sunlight's pretty benign. But the fossil fuel thing and a lot of the other fuels we use or try to use are not so benign. And is it internal or external? As I said, you own the sunlight. You don't own the fuel, so you have to buy that. 80% of the total input costs in agriculture can be traced directly to energy at this time. It's crazy. 120 years ago, that was essentially zero. So here's a number. In 1970, prior to Earl Butz, the price of wheat was $1.37 a bushel, and the average price of a barrel of oil was $3.39. 3 bushels of wheat bought you a barrel of oil. What's that ratio today? So you're taking a higher priced product to produce a lower priced product, right? And you just continue to do that. And I'm going like, okay, we probably should try to change that. It takes the energy of 1 gallon diesel fuel to manufacture and transport pounds of N. So 150 pounds of N is equivalent to 30 gallons of diesel fuel. Think about that when you put on fertilizer in the spring. Fossil fuel input in agriculture 120 years ago was essentially zero. And in 120 years, it will have to be zero again. So maybe it's this time that we start. So that's one of our goals now, is to be fossil fuel neutral. Fossil fuel was the aim for the Industrial Revolution of the UK. This thing I talked about, historic agriculture. It kind of just stuck in this thing where you couldn't transport things very far. Think of the guys in South America that grew corn. They didn't have any beasts of burden, so they couldn't really export other than carrying it on their back, so they couldn't go very far. One of the really interesting sidelights is Lewis and Clark bought corn from the Indians at Bismarck, North Dakota, because they were running low on supply. So we had a very active, very functional farming system going on in South and North Dakota when Lewis and Clark came through. I had a researcher one time in North Dakota jump up at a meeting when I said, I think you should look at growing corn in rotation. He jumped up and says, we can't grow corn in North Dakota. And I said, well, Lewis and Clark bought corn from the Native Americans. Maybe the USDA, who he worked for, should try to get their technology at least on par with what the Native Americans was in 1804. But in Europe, in 1850, in England, they were producing 2.3 million tons of steel, metric tons, annually, using coal. If they'd have tried to do, which is the way they did it before, it would have required cutting a forest of 97,000 square miles every year. That's an land area larger than all of the UK. So they'd have to cut down all the trees and get 1 year of fuel, right? Again, the Dakota Lakes Research Farm will be fossil fuel neutral by 2026. We're going to do it without fossil fuels because we see that as a big danger, the price of fuel, fossil fuels. We press our own oil seeds. We grow canola, flax, soybeans. We don't grow sunflowers, but our neighbors do. So we press all of our oilseed crops. 1 acre of canola will produce 60 to 80 gallons of oil. So my grandpa used to grow grow oats to feed the horses, right? This isn't that much different than doing that. So when you try to change, I have a guy that's been texting me, he wants to talk about transformational change because I use that word. But you need to start just thinking differently. Address the problem instead of treating the symptom. And we talked about this slide last night, actually. I took this slide in the 1980s hanging out of an airplane camera. You know, it didn't have the satellites and the drones and stuff to do it. But what's going on here is the guy built terraces because he had runoff. Well, terraces don't stop the runoff. They keep the runoff from going out of the field. So you're just kind of treating the symptom, but you don't really address the problem on the ground here. They really don't do you any good. I have learned more by observing nature than trying to change it. What we've always done is say, well, I want to change this ecosystem to be what I want it to be, instead of saying, okay, what will it let me do? And it's more of a guy thing than a girl thing, actually. Mother Nature's been managing these ecosystems better and for longer than anyone else. He's been doing genetics for longer than anyone else. Look at all the resistant weeds. You go out there and start throwing an herbicide out there, and she just goes, oh yeah, I can handle that. I can handle multiples. If you want to do that, I can do that, right? And all these techie guys are going, oh God, look what I got now. And she's going, oh yeah, you amateurs. You guys are just amateurs. You know, rookies. Nature harvests the maximum amount of sunlight. She leaks very few nutrients, including carbon dioxide, from the soil. Think of carbon dioxide as a nutrient. And it's probably the most limited that we have in a lot of ways. Okay? Sunlight, carbon dioxide are things you need to focus on. So if your organic matter has gone down, it's meant you've leaked carbon dioxide from the system. Play a little game. What percentage of the air we're breathing is nitrogen? 80%? 80%? What percentage of the air is carbon dioxide? Well, it used to be 180 parts per million, close to 400 parts per million. Put that in percent, it's 0.0004, yeah, 0.0004. Hardly any there. If you take wheat plant and a C4 corn plant or a C4 prairie grass, which a lot of our prairie grasses and grasses here are C4s, put them together in a sealed chamber, the wheat plant will die for lack of carbon dioxide, and the prairie plant will go on, and the corn plant or the millet plant will go on. Interesting stuff. She makes maximum use of water and nutrients by having these webs of mycorrhizal fungi, and it has a bunch of other tricks, but these are really important. If you do tillage, you don't have them. So we are getting a much better phosphorus usage efficiencies and those kind of things. And she uses animals, big ones and little ones, as part of the system. Are the nutrients available for plant use or environmental services, or have they been leached, eroded, or transported from the landscape? We're shipping our nutrients to China, and they're not going to send them back. I had some Taiwanese trade people at my farm one day because we're close to the state capitol, so the Secretary of Ag brings them out. That's kind of, nice place. I take them out there. And I'm showing them how we plant the wheat, and the cover crop is dying, it's feeding nutrients to the wheat and all that kind of stuff. And they didn't speak the language, but it's a translator. Well, then they're saying, well, you don't need fertilizer. And I said, well, I do need fertilizer if I'm going to sell my wheat to you in Taiwan, because you're not going to ship your human excrement back to me to use as fertilizer, so I'm going to have to buy some fertilizer, right? And they got these really shocked looks on their faces, when I said that, you're not going to send the poop back. And then all of a sudden they got to thinking about it, and they start jabbering and doing this kind of motion, because they get that in China. In is if you went to somebody's house for dinner at night, you would go to the bathroom before you went home. It would be impolite to take their nutrients with you. Okay, interesting concept. Ecosystems that leak nutrients turn into deserts. Think of Israel, the land of milk and honey. Read Loudermilk's work on what happened, and look at France. If you keep doing that, then you turn into a desert. 120 car train of canola contains 250 kilograms of phosphate, or that's over 500,000 pounds. The other way that they leave the landscape is if you got saline seeps. When you're doing wheat summer fallow on dry land, you probably have saline seeps. You're losing nutrients. Your pHs are going down because you're pushing that water down and it goes sideways. Nutrients being leached through soil go to deep layers and eventually move to aquifers or to discharge areas or to aquatic ecosystems. Surface layers see a decrease of pH and fertility in organic matter. Weeds and diseases are nature's way of adding diversity to a system that lacks it. Mother Nature is an opportunist. If you provide an opportunity, she'll find a species to put there. And that, again, is where cover crops come in at times. You're adding that diversity. We do it with crop rotations and then sometimes with cover crops, right? So we're putting beneficial diversity in there. So nature's efforts to add diversity can be countered by adding beneficial diversity to the system. Organic matter, we need to build organic matter up because that increases the water holding capacity. Organic matter fluffs your soils. Ever notice somebody builds a house, they build a sidewalk, put in a lawn next to the sidewalk, and there's like this much difference between the lawn and the sidewalk. Whatever. Come back 5 years later and the lawn's as high as the sidewalk. And then another 5 years it's over the sidewalk. They're building that volume there with roots and soil mixed together. And that really helps hold water. Within all texture groups, as organic matter increased from 1 to 3%, the available water capacity doubled. Think of that in terms of farming. Go back. When organic matter content increased to 4%, it then accounted for more than 60% of the available water holding capacity. These were my daughters many years ago. The oldest one's 29 now. Youngest one's 24. But look at the root system on that prairie plant. Compare that to what you're putting in there now. It's not even close. We think we're eventually going to have perennial sequences to make it work. Right. I'm just going to show you a little data. These are long-term field scale plots that we have. Different crop rotations. These two rotations from the standpoint of winter wheat are fairly similar. The year before winter wheat's pea, the year before pea is corn. In all these cases, these are the same rotations, different years. The difference here is we add another broadleaf crop. So we got 50% broadleaf. Broadleaves, peas, sunflowers, soybeans, canola, lentils, alfalfa don't have much carbon. They have a very narrow carbon and nitrogen ratio. So you look at a prairie is mostly grasses. High carbon and nitrogen ratio. That's where the organic matter came from. So when we started doing these rotations, we had this low residue, this 50% residue rotation in there because the winter wheat breeders that work with us wanted to have something that would challenge winter hardiness. They wanted us to do tillage so they could test for winter hardiness. I said, I can do that just with a stupid rotation. So we did this stupid rotation for 20-some years. And now we've changed it to having a perennial sequence. But in dry years, 2006, where we had 7.9 inches of rain from the time the peas were harvested until the wheat was mature, the 12 months in that interval from when the peas were harvested, doubled yields with that higher residue rotation. Here, in even a good year like 2005, where we had more than our normal rainfall, 92 versus 57, almost double, and 6.4 inches in 2002 is the first time we saw it, was again almost double, or that's almost exactly double. So here's a photograph of the wheat in the low residue rotation. Here, right across the road, is a high residue rotation. There's an aerial photograph of it. Here's the high residue, here's the low residue. Organic matter makes a difference. Had a friend of mine that's a farmer whose brother was in Afghanistan during the troubles there in 2001 in that area. This photo was actually taken in January of 2002. But his brother was over in Afghanistan doing mission work, and was no-tilling. His brother kept coming home to the farm and watching how good the land was doing at home, so he managed to get a no-till drill into Afghanistan and pulled it with a Belarus tractor. I don't think I have a picture of the tractor there. But they didn't have a lot of success. Well, what's the problem there? Not doing tillage, but there's no residue. There's no armor there. Well, what happens is in Muslim countries, a lot of lesser developed countries, the residue, you take it off and take it to the building, because you leave it there, somebody else takes it. It's not like here where they leave it alone. I work in Morocco where we actually had to hire somebody to guard it, because somebody would come and take it, so the guy'd spend his nights out there in the tent to keep people from coming and getting the residue. And this guy, he was hauling off with his semis, and he was, if you looked at it, he was actually pulling up by the roots or his straight trucks, whatever. But that was the Hindu Kush, which one time had a lot of trees and lush meadows and whatever. Look at the landscape. Okay? What does Mother Nature do? She makes maximum use of water and nutrients of them and other treks, animals, big ones and small ones. We have the big ones. We use cattle. In dry or brittle climates, like you would have here in the summer, soil biology slows at times of low soil moisture. The rumen of grazing animals remains moist during those periods of time and keeps that biology going. So I think the livestock are an important part of what we're doing. In cold climates, which we're colder than you guys are, the biology slows during times of low soil temperature, so the rumen of the grazing animals remains warm, continuing these processes. So after we harvest wheat, on all of our irrigated ground, we have wheat in the rotations. We also have corn and beans and whatever, and we do on our dry land. And all of our irrigated ground and our dry land ground, when we think we have enough moisture, we will plant cover crops immediately after harvest of the wheat. And depending on what that crop is going to be the next year determines the mix. If we're going to go to broadleaves, we won't have broadleaves in the mix. If we're going to go to corn, we'll have oats and barley and peas and flax and those kind of things. And then we'll let this get to about this stage when we're be primed for making hay out of it. September sometime. And we swath it, and we will graze those swaths. They will stay in the field all winter, and we'll graze them through the winter. Snow doesn't bother us. There's my glove for moving. I told somebody last night that I put on my orange gloves, the cows get excited. If I have just regular gloves on or bare hands, they go, he's not going to move any. But if I put on my insulated gloves, they go, oh, the big guy's going to move the fence. Here we go. But look how nice that hay stays. It's amazing. If you nailed that up, it will go bad at times because it's too moist at that period of time of year. It's hard to get it dry enough. Late in the swath and it's fine. Then we use, where we have irrigation, we put the wires on the irrigation machines. So to move fence, you just go out. If it's a lateral move, you unhook 2 hooks on the machine and hook them back up again. If it's a pivot, you just unhook one and move it and hook it back up again. So it's really kind of slick. We fall calve. Those are our cows and their calves. We calve in August and September. So there's a lateral move. The thing I want to point out that we've used a stripper head to harvest the wheat, and that straw is laying right there, and they don't touch it. So our armor's all in place. It's just a slickest system. And I'm taking a picture there of right where the swath was. They don't leave anything, because we're moving that irrigator every day, and it's like reading a feed bunk. You go out there, and if they've eaten it all, that's about right. And if they haven't eaten it all, then you don't move it quite so far the next day. We also run the same type of system through our corn stalks, so the cows usually have access to some corn and some swaths. And this year we struggled because we had early snow, and the corn stalks are a challenge when they have a lot of snow in them, but the swaths are no problem at all. They'll just go and find that swath and just follow it, and it's slicker than heck. We have a big tour wagon that we use. We have two of them actually, semi-trailers with bleachers on them, and we put this wing on this one, and that folds down, and that gives us shelter for the calves. So there it is out in the field, and we can move that with the cattle. Just post hanging on the 3 per span, and then we got this little piece of pipe that gives us a weight on the bottom that we tie on the bottom of the post. The only way to produce human edible protein on marginal land is to use ruminant animals. This whole Impossible Burger and whatever thing is kind of a moot point. And you know, if they're going to eat that, that's fine, but that's their problem. They make it out of peas and stuff we grow anyway, so it doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. But if you go into marginal land, produce a lot of food on there for humans to eat. It has to go through something to make it human edible. Unfortunately, doing all these things is only stopping the bleeding. I mean, we as farmers alone, we can no-till, we can do diverse rotations, we can do all this stuff, but until we get politicians and society at large on track with what we're doing, we're just stopping the bleeding. We quit. They used to close the highway between Pierre and Gettysburg, where I taught school, and the state capital where I live now, on a regular basis in the winter due to blowing dirt. And that doesn't happen anymore. And the governor came out a few years ago and visited our farm. Actually, he was the 3rd governor that's been there in the last 30 years. But I showed him an old clipping of when they closed the road between Oneida and Gettysburg and Oneida and Pierre. It says, if you want the Cliff Notes version of what we've done, this doesn't happen anymore. Now there's a lot more to do because we got a lot of people not doing it, and we have a lot of cities doing stupid things and whatever. It's got to be more than just us. Agriculture cannot do this alone. Needs all of society to have a brain transplant. Ecosystem degradation, which has been going on since man started walking upright, I think, is just a symptom of indifference, greed, jealousy, selfishness, ignorance, hubris, etc., etc. It's just we really don't care. It's not going to impact us. I don't want it to impact us, but we're borrowing from the past and stealing from our children. And I just think we need to, as I get older and older, I get more and more grumpy about that. Bureaucracies, governments, and corporations are operated by people with limited tenure. I've gone through multiple deans with multiple ideas of what they think should be done. We now have a great-grandson of one of the farmers at the table with me and 3 other people to come up with the idea of Dakota Lakes. We have a great-grandson of one of those guys that's on the board, and our goals are exactly the same. It's not different. Preserve the land, make it sure that we have a good lifestyle and time for family and all these things that we think are valuable in community, but not degrade to do that. Society, landowners, farmers deserve to have long-term research. Universities don't do that anymore because it's all grant funded. We continue to do that. The climate will change, but you'll still be continental climate where you're more of you get more winter rainfall. We're a true continental climate. But the biggest thing to change what's happening is the way we farm, because we're not using the water. We're not capturing the sunlight like native systems do. So you can compensate a lot for the change in climate that's happening simply by using better practices. That's a bigger issue. That degradation of the ecosystem has more impact. Farmers and ranchers harvest sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, produce products we can sell. Some of this is human food, so we need to be aware of nutrition issues and off-site impacts. If you want to eat beef, maybe we should concentrate on producing beef instead of corn or barley that feeds beef in feedlots. We hired a new West River Ag Center director a few years ago. I was in on the interview process, and I asked the two final candidates, do you think there'll be feedlots in 40 years? One of them said no. The follow-up question is, how do you change your research program to get ready for that? But the reason she said no is because you look at how the nutrient concentration, amount of energy that goes in cutting silage and hauling it, the resistant bacteria and stuff that's developing there. Just look at all the issues with feedlots and large dairies and whatever. That's not probably a long-term system that's going to work. So let's try to disperse them back out like they were, where we had animals dispersed across the landscape. So this year's calf crop will be the first one we're going to try to take all the way to harvest in the fields. So that's where we're at. Doing the right thing environmentally is almost always the correct economic approach in the long run. Think about that one. And I know your bankers aren't on board because they got short-term goals too. Right? So you need to think about this thing a little differently. The best time to make this change, have a brain transplant, was 600 years ago. The guy who said, I know how to farm with tillage, that's no-till the thing. Brain transplant idea. Because farmers would come to him and say, Ralph, I want to be a no-tiller. And he goes, well, first go down to Dakota Lakes and get your brain transplanted and then come back. Think about things differently. Second best time is now. We may not have another chance, unfortunately. Take the E out of ET and take the T out of can't. So, now like I said, there's an agri-ecosystems management thing. You can go to our website. If you go to our website, you'll find an old thing that's no-till guidelines for the arid and semi-arid prairies. That's a bit out of date in terms of the chemical names I use in there, but that might be good reading as well. But the best thing you could do is get Tony to organize a little trip and come visit. So I already said that to him. I said, the best thing I could do, instead of talking to these guys today, is just dump them in the bus and go over, take a look. But do it in the summer. It's a little nicer than today. But those cows are out there all winter. We do not have a pen that cows go to. And they never have a permanent spot where they sit. They just are moving all the time. And we're, we got automatic feeders now that we're putting on a trailer that'll move along with them, so they'll be able to each have individual rations, so the calves can actually be put back after the wean, be put back in the herd, and they can get fed one ration, the cows another one. So we'll use some supplementation plus a lot of forage to bring them up to harvest. Any question? Yes.
So organic matter percentage in soil.
Well, we started with some of them at 1, and we're bringing them up. I don't know that it depends on the crop rotation. Very big influence. Like I showed you the one with the every other year broadleaf, that actually hasn't changed much, even with no-till. And then the one with 2/3 has changed a little. We got one that's 80% high residue crops. That's moved a lot. And if you come, I'll take you out with a spade and you can see it with your eyes. Problem with using organic matter content as the only criteria to look at. It doesn't tell you the quality. And I used to say, before the present era, when you could say things, I used to say, it's like saying 300 pounds a woman, there's not enough information. But I can't say that anymore. Okay, so I don't say that anymore, but you get the idea. You've got to think about the quality of the organic matter, and how high can you go with it, and what are you doing with it. But it's definitely gone up by a bunch. We have one field that's been continuous irrigated corn since 1990, and from a farming perspective, that's the highest organic matter. Now that bad rotation that was every other year broadleaf, we have changed that, so it's now the three-way, just like the one we started to, plus a 5-year perennial sequence of grass that we either graze or use for seed. So half the field is grazed and half is used for seed. And then we have 5 years of that, and then 15 years of the other thing, and then 5 years of that on any piece. I got 4 fields in that mix. So in 20 years we'll have really good data. Think about that. I probably won't really care. I'm sure I'll be drooling in my oatmeal in 20 years, right? But somebody cares. And Mother Nature works in these long time frames. And so you've got to start looking at that. But that'll raise organic matter more than anything else to put a perennial grass in there, because it has that massive root system. And that'll pull the lime and stuff back to the surface, and it'll get your pH and everything all fixed and whatever. Now, the big question is, how in the heck do we get the government to not punish you for doing that? We need to all start asking the government for the right things. We're asking them the wrong things. See, and they're giving us these handouts. But that's not what we need. I'll give you a little number. I got 2 minutes. 2013, the federal government spent $14 billion on subsidies for crop insurance. They spent $2.6 billion for all ag research from the federal level. So all the USDA ARS stations and all the money they sent to the university from the federal side. $2.6 billion total. $14 billion in subsidies. This year we're getting the subsidy. We still got about $2.4 billion for research. We're getting the crop insurance subsidies, plus now we have another $22 billion on top of that in Trump bump money. I mean, wouldn't it be better if we threw that kind of money into figuring out better ways of doing things? Just a thought. Anyway, I'll be around all day because Tony's my ride. So, anyway, thank you.